to call this work session to order at 12:07, September 23rd. And we're very lucky to have Susan coming in today to do some work with us on implicit bias and to grow our awareness in this area. So super excited about it. I've been voice it for a long time, so welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, we're glad to be here. We want to give you as much of the experience that the teachers and principals and others are getting, and also we want to be evaluated. So we have a pre-assessment that I'd like for you all to take. Let me give them a quick overview first. It's real. You'll see it's written for teachers. So there are going to be things that are just not applicable to you. You can just skip those. That's not a problem. You'll be able to tell. If anything feels a little applicable, go for it, but don't feel like you have to answer everyone. And let me just read to you what they hear when they get it, and so you as well. As part of a larger community research partnership between the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center and the school district, we're inviting you to participate in a pre-assessment used to evaluate the implicit bias and equity professional development. The evaluation is being conducted by researchers at the Public Policy Center to measure this intervention's implementation and effectiveness in addressing equity issues in the district. This does not ask for your name. Your individual responses will be kept anonymous, and responses are never used to evaluate individuals. It's really to evaluate the project. Then next summer, they expect to be able to deliver a report on the results of the evaluation. We'll have to think, since you're such a small group, I'm not sure they'll publicly report like the school board. Maybe, because what they're able to do, we do a pre-assessment and then we do a post-assessment, so we're able to show if there's progress. So we just don't want it to be personally identifiable, to stick with that anonymity. The information you provide is critical to the evaluation and important to help improve programming. We do use the data every year as we make changes. And it should take about 10 minutes, maybe even less, since some of these questions aren't going to be applicable. Don't stress over them. It's really a pre-assessment, so just kind of go through and answer as much as you can. But don't try not to take more than 10 minutes, if you would. And then what I'd like you to do is, when you're done, we'll just put them on the corner of the table, and they'll send them off, because we don't ever see the individual responses. So we'll ask him maybe to send them off to the Public Policy Center. Okay? And I have pens if anyone needs a pen. Okay? Awesome.
And the coach would be Susie Miller.
Yeah. It'll ask you for your school, so you can put board, and your coach would be Cersei. Kim, can you send those to Sarah Bruck at the policy center?
I will, yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, we've got a few warm-up things we want to do before we get started. So the first thing we'll have you do is play a quick little game called Guess Who. You may know this. We're going to give it in a get this going over here. There's a particular way we're going to go about this, and I'm going to let Michael Norton explain.
I'm Michael Norton. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School and the co-author of the new book, Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. I want to talk to you today about a piece that we have in the July-August issue of Harvard Business Review. But before I tell you what's in that piece, I first want to ask you to play a game with me. You're looking at an array of faces right now. I'm going to ask you to play a version of the game that you may have played as a little kid that was called Guess Who. And if you remember that game, you and a partner both had faces in front of you. One of you had a face, and the other person had to guess the face you were looking at from that array of faces. I want you to play this game with me right now. Grab a partner and pick a face that your partner is going to have to guess. And the only rule is your partner can only ask you questions that you can answer with the words yes or no. Pause this video and take a few minutes to play the game. When you're done playing the game, come back, hit unpause, and I'll tell you more about the research that we've conducted.
All right, so understand the rules of the game? So partners, Steve, you want to come be a partner here?
I can do
Yeah?
that.
Charlie, maybe you and Kim can?
I think
No?
Paul's on it. Paul's almost here too, so.
Okay, good. So we'll take a minute, pick one person picks a face, the other one asks yes or no questions. If you figure it out, then switch roles. Okay? All right, go.
I got the person figured out.
All right, so I asked you
I'll pick
questions.
face. I got one.
So you can turn and look, because
So
that'll
we're
help
actually
you.
trying to figure it out
I
now?
don't play this game, so I don't know what my favorite is. So,
Any questions? So we have this at home, we've got a bunch of different versions of it. So for instance, you might say, does the person have hair?
I think
Like
we
that.
picked that person. If the person had.
man?
Okay.
Yes.
What color are their eyes?
No, it has to be yes or no.
Oh, yes or no?
Earrings.
Yeah.
Okay. Are their eyes?
Um,
Does he have hair?
I can't tell.
I don't know.
That's all we can hear.
Does he have a deer?
Yes.
Glasses and the hat.
Yeah, that was, there you go. That was a hard one, because how do you answer that? Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so I have,
I had to give an I don't know answer, which gave it away right away.
okay, so I have a person.
What's it?
I have a person.
You got a person, okay.
Under the
Is it a female?
Yes.
Can't tell.
Let's take about 5 more seconds,
Is
1 or 2 more
she
questions.
wearing a hat?
No.
No.
Does she have white hair?
No.
Okay. Is she wearing a necklace?
Is their hair long?
No.
All right.
Is she a woman
Did
on the
anyone
bottom right-hand corner?
guess?
No.
Anyone get
I
it?
think so.
Yeah, everyone?
I got
Okay. Okay. All right, let's hear what Michael Norton has to say.
So you finished the game. How did it go?
Third one.
What kinds of questions did your partner ask you? Maybe they asked, is this person smiling or not? Or is this person wearing a hat or not? Or maybe they asked a question like, is this person black or not? But if they did, that would be quite unusual, because in the research that we've done, we find people are very, very reluctant to ask about race when we have them play the exact game that you just played. Why are people reluctant? It appears as though they feel that by asking about race, it might signal that they care a lot about race, and it might even signal that they might be a racist. We find in our experiments that even though the array was half white and half black, and asking the question, is the person white or black, a very useful tool for narrowing down the faces, people are really, really reluctant to ask about that question. And in fact, in another version of the game, we find that if we have people play with a black partner, they become even more unlikely to ask about race because they're even more worried that they might appear to be biased when they do that. And there's an even worse outcome, because people who avoid asking about race, even though they are trying to do so to look as though they don't care about race, end up looking more uncomfortable and more biased. I think the dynamics in this game, which you and your partner just experienced, really suggest how complicated and interesting the dynamics are when we talk about race in contemporary America. We also tried some different versions of this game. In one of them, we actually asked not grown-ups to play the game, but for children to play what is, in the end, a children's game. We wondered when we had them play the game you just played whether the same thing might happen. What we found is that older children, by the time they were 9 or 10, actually stopped asking about race in the game. They'd already learned that maybe it's not wise to ask about race. But the kids who were younger, who were 7 and 8, who weren't so concerned about those social norms yet, in fact, were more likely to ask about race. And as a result, they ended up beating the older kids, performing better on the game. We tried one other version of the game. We ran a version of the game that's very much like the one you played again, but with one difference. In this case, all of the faces were white, but each picture had, in the lower corner of the picture, a white or a black dot. And we wanted to see if it's not about race, if it's not about is this person white or black, but more is this dot white or black, if now people would be very willing to use color because it could be so useful for guessing the face. And that is exactly what we see as well. So if it's race, people will not ask the question black or white, but if it's the color of a dot, like the color of paint on a wall, people are perfectly happy to ask about white or black. And it really suggests that it's the social dynamics surrounding race that make us so uncomfortable talking about color. We know in everyday life, people often struggle to describe someone in the workplace who may be of a different ethnicity. And while the motivation comes from a good place, which is I don't want to be or appear racist, it ends up impeding communication. And organizations that are savvy realize that a good solution to race is not to avoid talking about race, which, as you saw when you played the game, can impede communication between people, but actually acknowledge race openly. One of the things that we see when we talk to companies that are forward-looking in this space is they're being open and honest about racial differences between workers and among workers. Thanks for taking time to play our game.
All right, so we generally start with that before we have anything, before we even give like the name of the project, because we really want to see where people are. Are they ready to talk about race or not? Did any of you ask whether they're black or white as one of your questions?
No.
Very typical response. Yeah, we're uncomfortable doing that. And we're about to get people to embark in a project where we absolutely have to talk about race. So that's part of how we're getting into it, is to help you to understand it is hard. It's normal that it's hard. It's not good that it's hard, but that is the way we are in society, and we need to kind of deal with that. And we say that because our premise really for the project fundamentally is we in the district are experiencing racial disproportionality. We've got disproportionate outcomes for kids of color in achievement, in their experiences in schools, in discipline, in the climate and culture of the schools, all of these things we've been looking at. So we know that there's disproportionality by race. So if we want to overcome that, we got to talk about race. So we have to engage in that. What his research is suggesting, they did the game, and then they would do a series of questions and things to try to figure out what's underlying it. And a big part of what they came up with is the idea of color blindness. That color blindness gets in the way of our ability to do the work we have to do. So we try to get people to kind of think about color blindness. What is color blindness and how does it play out? So we define it simply as the avoidance of talking about race or acknowledging racial differences. It's not that we don't see it, it's that we avoid talking about it. The differences are there, but we avoid talking about it. That's color blindness. So our question to you, and first kind of discussion is, have you encountered the notion of color blindness, or does it make some intuitive sense to you? And if so, where do you think the idea behind not talking about race comes from, or came from in your experience?
So I'm having a different sort of reaction. I'm trying to remember the gentleman that came and spoke to our team at ACT, but his thing was little kids are colorblind. I mean, I think he actually used that word, that little kids playing together, they're not caring if it's an African American kid, if it's Hispanic, Latino girl, whatever, that they're colorblind, and that was actually an aspiration for us to be colorblind. So I'm having a little bit of a different reaction to the word, but the connotation is very different in what's being described here. I'm thinking, yes.
I don't think that the aspiration is different. I think that's actually at the core of what we've learned about color blindness. I mean, what have you all learned about color blindness? And in what ways? Has it changed over your lifetime?
I have found that it's a very sensitive topic when you're speaking in discussion about employment.
Mhm.
That people become very sensitive to talking about race in regards to choosing an employee, one person over another in
Mhm.
hiring.
So it's hard to talk about race as a factor
People
or as
become
a...
very, it's very sensitive,
Mhm.
yeah.
What do you think's underlying that?
Equal opportunity hiring practices, I mean.
Yeah, and fear of saying somebody's getting the job just because of their skin color and not because of their abilities.
I think you're kind of beat over the head with people are who they are based on their actions and the things that they do. It doesn't matter what their race is, so just put that over here because it's meaningless, right? And so then just, oh yeah, I put it over here.
Or in the context of, well, I treat everybody the same, and so the race doesn't really come into it because I have this sort of neutral way that I approach all people, or kids and students. And I think it comes from the impulse of wanting to treat everybody the same. I think it comes from that place of, well, I'm not treating black kids differently, therefore I'm not a racist, because I'm not probably in that context discriminating against them or treating them in an inferior way. That's probably been a lot of my experience with colorblindness.
Well, I never really, the first time I remember encountering someone black was when there was a foreign exchange student at West Branch that came to stay at our house. It was a weekend thing. And it was a guy from Kenya. And I thought it was really neat because he was young and he drank coffee. It was my first, and I was probably in my elementary grades. And I thought it was neat. And he also said that he drank coffee to go to sleep, which, everyone, the thought was his coffee kept you awake. And, that was kind of my first, and didn't really have a lot of experiences until I got a job working in Central America, where I was the only white person in the country that was 94% either Hispanic or black. And that's where I met my wife. And when I saw her, I thought she was beautiful. I didn't see her as anything else. And I remember my older brother said, "So you're going to marry a black girl?" And that really hit me because I hadn't seen her that way until then. And then sometimes, and I did some work in the former Soviet Union, and I showed them, they asked me, "Will you have a picture of your wife?" And I showed it to a guy, and he said, "Oh, so you have a black wife." And I never really thought of it that way. I always thought of it as my wife. Not to say that I don't have some preconceptions and things like that, but I think I benefited from being immersed in a environment where we're out in the middle of nowhere and we all go work together. And yeah, you try to see everybody for what they are and what they bring, and not for any preconceived stereotype or notion. But it isn't, but in that exercise with Sean, I have to say that, yeah, there's that reluctance to say, yeah, the easiest thing to say is you can cut the field in half just by saying, okay, are they black or are they white? No, we don't do that. It's like, do they have a hat? Do they have earrings? The background. And Sean had a good one in the background. Is it red or blue? And I thought, that's great.
Color, but not race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and that. So yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
And there's also some connotations that go along with the word black and white. So like when my daughter was in kindergarten and she would describe her friends, she would say, well, they have brown skin. And I know what she meant by that, but she, you know, she was referring to black kids. Well, their skin isn't black. She was just simply describing the color of their skin is brown. So when we put the word white and black on it, we have this negative connotation that comes with that label.
Sometimes negative, for some people quite positive.
Well, in terms of describing a person as in, you know, categorizing them.
So
Yeah.
there are things about it that feel negative.
It feels,
And for some people, to be called black generates pride, beauty, power, you know, so it can be a positive also.
yeah,
All
it's
of that is
like-
cultural. All of that is connected. All of that is there, even if we are engaging and it's not a factor for us, it is a factor in our culture. And I think that's kind of the key point of this. I grew up in Tipton, 10 miles from West Branch. In 1983, my teacher read to us Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He had been there at the time that King delivered the speech in Washington, D.C. He cried in front of, I mean, it was this powerful moment for me in an all-white town learning about race. And yet, most people who read this speech focus on we should judge people by the content of the character, not the color of their skin. Absolutely, that's aspirational.
Yes.
But it isn't reality. It is not the way your brother, your community members experience people of color. So it's that sort of avoidance of acknowledging that's not helping us right now because it actually is a factor.
I guess I'll let you
Yeah.
personal experience. It's really difficult because I think when you think about someone saying, I don't see you as you are, basically this whole color blindness thing, and again, it comes from a very good place. All men are created equal, you know, those kinds of things, and we are. But I think that there's something about when someone says, I don't see you as black. I mean, that's very offensive to me, and people have said that. Well, I don't see you as black, I just see you as another administrator. Okay. I mean, if they just said, well, you're a very good administrator, blah, 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 and left the reference of race out of it, it would have been different. But when they say, I don't see you as black, I just see you as another administrator, that's very, very hurtful. And it really does negate my race. That is like, you know, what am I, chopped liver? I have a race or an ethnicity, and I'm very proud of that. And so when people say things like that, I think they don't mean to be mean and that kind of thing, but it's just a level of unawareness. They're not aware of how hurtful that is. And so my heart goes out to kids when people say that to them. Well, I don't see you as black, I just see you as another little girl. Well, no, if it's a black girl, you just negated her whole race, her history, her whole, absolutely, absolutely. And so, you know, our words are very powerful, and we really have to think about that.
And you're making me think about, we're potentially negating a source of real power and strength and love. To be known as a black girl brings with it kinship that I don't have, but that can be very much something she brings to the classroom. That's interesting. All right, so we'll share with you, we'll email you a link to the slides and then a couple of other links. Here's a TED Talk by Melody Hobson that talks about being color brave instead of colorblind. And so I'll invite you to do that.
Can I ask, this is probably a tangent question, but I know we're explicitly talking about race, ethnicity, color, but so many things that we're talking about, I feel like can apply to gender, can apply to other kinds of orientations that we have.
Yeah.
Sexual, your job, poverty, income, I mean, all these things, I feel like what we're learning here is applicable in those spaces too.
Absolutely, and we would say that you're absolutely right about that. But in this particular case, when we're looking at the disparities that we have that show up in our data, it really is about race. It's really not about poverty. It's not about the
See, because I get that question a lot. Are we talking about poverty or are we talking about race when we're talking about balancing our schools? And we've been using the data of free and reduced lunch, socioeconomic status as kind of measure of the differences between our schools, yet we're talking about integration from a racial standpoint? I mean, I feel like we should be clear on what we're
Poverty
talking
isn't,
about.
isn't necessarily a race, you know, it goes
Yeah.
there's poverty
Across
in
society.
all sides.
And yet the intersectionality of race and
Correct,
poverty.
right,
is-
yes, right,
So,
well,
yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
that's just an extra,
They interact in ways that are significant.
right.
And indeed, and we actually as a company are committed to all forms of equity, and we focus on race and explicitly focus on race in this project because we basically have 10 hours to work with people.
Yeah.
And what we find is no matter where, even when you're focusing in on race, people divert from talking about race. It just goes off the table. It's so much easier, believe it or not, to talk about special ed or poverty, and there's all kinds of biases in that too. But we want to focus on race because we need to talk about race. And then hopefully, our hope is that there will be opportunities to expand beyond race as well. Once we're getting more comfortable about that, then we can start to problematize the biases we have around poverty and gender and special ed and ELL and all of those things.
And those are easier to talk about.
I mean, the equity committee had a researcher studying the conversations that the equity committee had and truly found that until the equity committee started saying, we're having these agenda items, she was timing how long they spent talking about things, and race was just not talked about until it was on the agenda in an explicit way. And we see that all over the country. Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the consequences of colorblindness, as Ellen was especially talking about, it will invalidate people's lived experience in pretty significant ways. That is part of the process of sort of othering and making that not acceptable and not a part of our schooling, when yet it really very much is. Suggests that race is something bad, and it prevents us ultimately from both identifying and overcoming disparities. So we will talk about race. I'll say, this should actually say the not color blindness, but
Benefits.
color consciousness. So the alternate for us, color blindness is one side and color consciousness is the other, which is to acknowledge race and to be paying attention to the ways race do impact our lives and our schooling and our policy making and those kinds of things. And it really, we hope, kind of flips the whole thing. A lot of it is about acknowledging our own race, and so as white people, we often don't acknowledge whiteness as a race. We haven't had much experience with understanding what that means. And so part of talking about race is talking about whiteness, which is also uncomfortable. And there's a lot in that can be a real challenge. But then figuring out how is race a factor in my day-to-day life is hard when you feel like you don't have a race. And it's easier to assume everyone's experience is like mine because I am a-racial when I really do have a race, and it does matter, certainly to my schooling experience. As we look at the disproportionality we have, it mattered that I was white growing up. So, deep stuff, but yeah, so one of the barriers that we find in a lot of the exit tickets we get is, okay, I'm willing to talk about race, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know what terms to use. I don't know how to get started. I don't want to offend people. And so that's part of what we're trying to work on. And it's hard because we don't have much time with folks. So, and we could talk for a year about what's the appropriate term and why and where does it come from and all the history of that, and we don't have a year to do that. So we try to do a little bit of modeling about these kinds of questions of, number one, how do I refer to people's race and ethnicity, and what happens if I do say something offensive? And so it goes to some of the ways we set up some norms, which we'll start doing in a minute. And it goes to them saying, we've really just decided we better explicitly talk about terms. And this isn't something we did earlier in the project, partly because we assumed it had been done, because cultural competency training's been going on, and we realized that we really can't assume too much because people experience it in different ways and have different forms of cultural competency training and that sort of thing. So we just said, here's what we'll do. We'll share with you the terms we use. We'll briefly talk about maybe why and when. And our big question really is, are any of these terms offensive to you? If you identify as in one of these racial or ethnic categories, is the term we've chosen offensive to you? And so we will use Black or African American somewhat interchangeably. It often will depend on data that we're looking at, because sometimes data is collected in certain ways with certain terms, so we'll use the terms that it came up with. In general, we will use Black. African American is especially salient when we're talking about African immigrants as well, who identify really as African, not African American, and there's some important racial distinctions and ethnic distinctions there. So we will use those interchangeably to some extent. Hispanic and Latino have traditionally been kind of the generic terms we use, and we use them differently depending on the data set, usually. Latino is what we typically use. Latina and now Latinx are terms that are Latinx especially coming more into play, and so we'll try to use Latinx when we're talking generically about a large group of people.
Really?
Meaning an ex-Latin? Or
No,
what-
so
what- what-
what it
both
means is
Latino and
non-gendered. It's a non-gendered way of referring to Latino. Typically, because Latino and Latina would be a female,
Okay,
and so
okay.
trying to go non, and this isn't us, this is
No,
different.
no, 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 I
Yeah.
understand, well, for my wife, that's a
Yeah.
big one.
Yeah,
You know?
and I personally, I'm struggling with it myself, I will say.
Right. And-
Which we could talk about for a month.
And she just likes to be called an American,
Mhm.
because that's what she identifies as.
Sure, sure. So I would be interested if she were in the group for her to talk to us about that, because we don't want to engage in this work in ways that are offensive to her. I want her to understand we're going to be talking about students as a group, because they're experiencing school differently, if they are Latino or if they're white or if they're Black or if they're Asian. Native American, American Indian is another one where we will go back and forth, and I typically use American Indian because the people I work with prefer that term. Mixed race and biracial are terms that are often on surveys and things like that, so we typically try to go with what the survey says. Usually we'll use mixed race, white, and then people of color and students of color, to refer really to all but white. Those are the terms we use.
But white's a color.
Mhm.
That's one of this,
Yeah. And in our society, whiteness is the dominant
okay.
culture, and so we're always wanting to see if whiteness is the dominant culture, how are the rest of the society experiencing schooling in particular? Yeah? Fair?
Is it, so, one of the things I know when we look at the data, we look at kids that are, and it's listed under Black, but you talked about how some of them are non-English speaking families. Like, is it best to put them all together in the Black? Is it better to separate it out to see what we're really talking about?
I've definitely seen good data that separates it out, that tells a different story of kids who.
Right, but when we see the data, it's just.
It's all
Black.
together, I know. I've seen it disaggregated where there's a difference between kids who are Black and speak English as their first language and kids who are Black and don't speak English as their first language, definitely. But we do see it all lumped in as one category.
And one of our former board members specifically requested that we start providing data broken down by those two categories, African American and Black as separate. And we had asked, and Steve told us that really they can't, because that's not the categories the state uses. So we're kind of bound by what the categories were given.
Depending on the data you're looking at. Yeah. Schools can choose to ascribe additional characteristics to their students in their power school or something like that. There are ways for us to access more information. Generally, you're right, we're going to be limited by the big broad categories that are given to us. So Asian is another example. I don't know if you've had much experience thinking about subcategories within the Asian population. Yeah.
Not necessarily in the school district.
Yeah,
but
no,
from
not
my own
necessarily.
work experience, yeah. That's, can be very detailed, yeah.
And disproportionality within.
Yes.
So we can talk about Asian kids as all kids are like speaking,
Yeah.
and high affluent as well. And yet when you really start disaggregating, you will see many of the ethnicities within the broad Asian.
Well, and some of it is interesting how some of that is north to south, lighter skin tone to darker, that they're within Asian, some folks who are Southern Asian will say that, there's disparities there and in their interactions. And it's here to, South America, same way, maybe like skin tone differentiations that are generally speaking darker. It's like Shakespeare. It's like light good, dark bad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's seems to be pretty common, not just in the United States, but.
And we struggle a lot because we tend in Iowa City to have a black-white binary in our discussions about race. We've got the largest populations of kids tend to be African American or black. We have kind of a societal approach to talking about, when we talk about people of color in our minds, we're thinking black typically, and we don't get very nuanced about things like Asian students especially. And so we hope that we have opportunities to do that with you. We fall into it too. And we keep trying not to, but it's a broader narrative about race, which you can unpack and find some threads for why. But it's something we really try to work on as well. So the other question we had was, what if I use a term that is offensive without realizing it? And so part of this is why we have some norms, which we will get to, and part of it is understanding that we will make mistakes. We hear a lot of folks who aren't used to saying people of color will sometimes say colored people, which can be very, very offensive given the history of how that term was used. And so we put it right out there, like, we're going to make this mistake. How are we going to engage together when we make those mistakes? So we'll get to the norming in a minute. But just as a reminder, the premise that we're experiencing racial disproportionality, and that's why we need to talk about race. Okay? Cool. All right, so quick with the holding environment, grounding the work, a little bit of just the history. Some of you were here and made some decisions, and others of you weren't on the board yet. This is year 3 of a 3-year program. We reach every teacher in the district, roughly. There are going to be new teachers that come in after we've left a building and things like that, but roughly the idea is we will hit every teacher in the district. We are with teachers for a year, and then we go to another building and are with those teachers for a year, and now we're in year 3. So the first year we had 8 schools, elementary, middle, and high, and then last year we had 10, and this year we have 15 schools. In the secondary schools, we did Northwest Junior High as a whole school, but Southeast and Southeast we did small groups. So we did 2 small groups year 1, a couple small groups year 2, and then the final small group this year. Same with City and West, because they're such a large faculty. The way we're doing City and West now is we're basically doing the whole school. People who were in it in year 1 are in it again this year, partly because we make changes based on feedback, and partly because they can be helpful in the process. When you've got 100 people, it's very different than when you have 30. So they're all going through it more than once, and they're volunteers largely to be willing to do that. So we're excited that they're at the table. All the principals went through training in year 1, and then when we are in their buildings, they go through the trainings again. Again, they're different than year 1's training, but they go through it with their teachers as well. We had about 15 people in the central office that for 2 years worked with us, and now we're getting to do the school board. Because we didn't have a chance to work directly with you, we've been working with the equity committee, as you know, doing a lot of the how are we looking at the comprehensive equity. The program is 9 to 10 hours in length, 10 hours ideally, really 12 if we can get them, but we can't. So it's 9 to 10 hours over 9 to 10 months. And we intentionally wanted it sort of that way. We would have loved to have had 4 hours at August PD to kind of get everyone grounded, have these kinds of grounding, because you notice we haven't talked about implicit bias at all. And we're already a third of our way through, because you got to get some grounding stuff going. That just didn't work, partly. Partly, we also agreed that when we look at the Iowa professional development model, really good professional development takes place over time. Distributed practice, do, learn, think, have some time, mull it over, try out a couple things, come back, reflect, do, learn, think, that sort of thing. So doing it over time, we understand to be more impactful than doing it all at once. You're kind of getting it all at once in 3 hours. So you're not going to get everything, and it won't be quite the same. But because if we could say to you, okay, now go do these things, and you go do some things and come back and we reflect with you, we would get to a different level of engagement. So we're actually pretty pleased with how it's playing out. We get some Thursday early outs for the buildings, and then when we don't, we have a half hour 2 days in a row. So either before school when teachers are there in the secondary, or after school when they stay in elementary. And we'll do a half hour one day and then a half hour the next day. Not ideal, but it always takes time to warm up after a month. We find that they warm up the first day, we've taken half of the half hour, but when they come back the second day, they're ready to go. So it works way better than we worried that it might not. And this is kind of the basic schedule. We'll do the launch in September. In a couple schools, we were able to get in October. And then we come back and we do some norming, and we talk about implicit bias as a cognitive process. So really understanding the way our brains work and how we think, and how that can lead to cognitive errors, which we then talk about as implicit biases. Then we move into how implicit bias can impact in disciplinary practices. And from that, we move then into achievement, implicit bias and achievement. All throughout, we've got our circular graphic there because we are continuously offering strategies for overcoming the influence of implicit bias. We also wrap up at the end with a couple sessions where we go back through. So what are those individual strategies, and then what are those collective strategies? And then wrap up. Uh-oh, I said no. All right, so let's do a little bit of norming amongst ourselves as we're having a conversation about race that I'm assuming everyone other than Ellen identifies as white. But Ellen is here. It is an interracial conversation. And so we need to do norming anyway, and we especially do when we're in an interracial conversation. So Ellen, I'll let you just use a typical way of walking through the norming process.
We're going to talk about stay engaged. Again, the work is going to be different. It's going to be messy. So we invite you to stay engaged. I know that there will be things, we always say this to teachers, there will be a lot of things that are on your mind when you walk into the room for training. You know, there may be something that you forgot to do at home or something you need to do when you get done here. But we're just asking you to stay engaged. And even when things get a little difficult or a little uncomfortable, we're just going to ask you to just stay involved, stay in the work.
And I know we're off on time, but I think it's okay to let them have their conversations like you would normally do it. I really do.
Okay, good. Then since I just talked about the first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign you to talk about the experiencing discomfort and then the other ones. Let me go ahead and talk about anonymity because we usually share that one, and then respecting each other's time. So when I'm meeting with staff, I usually talk about anonymity in terms of not being able to identify where the information came from. So if I was sharing something that Cersei said, and I said, Cersei said so-and-so, well, I've already identified her. Or if I've said something, the superintendent, well, everybody knows who the superintendent is. But if I said, well, during one of our conversations, someone mentioned, and I'm leaving that person's name out and you can't identify that person, that's anonymity. So we're not asking you not to talk about the work because we hope that you're excited and you're learning and that you want to talk to each other about it. So the anonymity part just talks about making sure that the people who say things, it's kind of like what's in Vegas stays in Vegas, that those people aren't out in terms of what they said. Respecting each other's time, this is a really important one, especially when we're working in the schools because we realize we only have like that half hour. And so we're asking people to come in right away and so we can get to work. And then we also, they can also look forward to getting out on time and make sure that we are abiding by their contracts and getting them out on time. So we respecting each other's time also could mean like if you have a phone call to make that you step out and you come back in and take care of yourself. But respecting that we need to be in here, we need to be working for the time that we have allotted to us.
So today, we're going to plan to take a break at 1:30, and then we'll go till 3, right? So that's our time boundaries for today.
Okay. So I'm going to assign,
You could do the pairs for those 3, and then we can all do a student public.
okay. All right, so I'm going to start with you guys. I'm going to pair you up, and you're going to do the experience discomfort. What does that mean to you, first of all? And then what would it look like if we were actually experiencing discomfort?
in this particular learning situation, okay? And then the two of you, I'm gonna have you do expect and accept non-closure. All right, what does that look like? What does it mean to you? And you guys, would you do speak your truth? Okay? And so I'm gonna give you a few minutes to talk with each other about what that means to you, and then what it might look like, and then we'll share out with each other, and then we'll come back and talk about some positive intent as a whole. All right? So go ahead, get started.
So we're talking about just intention. What you think, what you're feeling in your mind.
Right, that it's an ongoing conversation.
And expressing feelings, emotions, what is, when you say this, how that makes you feel, when you do this, how that makes, but being okay and saying, trying to do this, because you can't learn if we don't speak the truth. People can't learn if we don't speak the truth, right?
Yeah, I think it kind of also goes with like.
To final conclusion.
But in a way that is, that kind of keeps
But I
people
can see how,
engaged. I mean, there's a way of speaking your truth that can be very, like, too quiet, beating on the bush, so people don't get it, or, like,
Yeah, it's gotta be.
open that allows that learning to occur, that understanding to form. Because you gotta figure out, you gotta know what your truth is. I mean, that takes some work too sometimes, to really get down to the nub of it.
listening, trying to understand, changes the narrative that hard to explain. But just letting.
Okay, we're gonna come back together. Let's hear from our group that was doing experience discomfort. What does that mean to you and what would it look like?
Well, yeah, we talked about how what it means is, well, one, that it's you're going to have an uncomfortable conversation, so either you don't know what to say or you don't want to say the wrong thing. And that could look like not having much of a conversation, just really limiting kind of what you talk about. Or it could look like, if you're in kind of an uncomfortable situation, letting that happen and sitting there with it and maybe not trying to explain it away or come up, but just sort of be uncomfortable and maybe try to listen to understand what people are talking about and just sitting with it. But going through with it and having hard conversations rather than avoiding it because I don't want to feel uncomfortable or don't know what to say.
One of the things that we will see, and we don't have time to do a lot of this kind of work, but if we're in a session and we're talking and it gets a little uncomfortable, often someone will tell a joke or say a little something funny, and then the room laughs and it all gets comfortable again. And when that happens, see, there you go. That got a little uncomfortable because you think maybe I do this, right?
I do that.
Yeah. And sometimes that's important. Sometimes it gets so uncomfortable it becomes unproductive.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to lower the heat a little bit, but usually it means we're avoiding the work. So one of the things we'll talk about is notice when someone tells, when we're laughing, stop and think, why are we laughing and what were we doing right before? And are we avoiding something? Anyway, so it's one of the ways it can look.
Just touch on that. I think at the work session where we had the teachers from Longfellow and Twain in, I kind of ended it with a joke, funny comment type of thing, because I really did feel like,
You were maybe,
Yeah.
you needed to lower the heat a little bit.
Before we
Yeah.
left.
And you were doing that strategically, I suspect.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's okay when you're, but you should be intentional about it.
Right. That's great. Excellent. Okay, how about expect and accept non-kosher?
Well, we were talking about sort of within the confines of this 3-hour time period and beyond, right? That it's, you're not just gonna fix it. And all of a sudden, I'm all good now. Right? I got my work done. And the conversation is continual and evolving, and as, pointed out during that conversation that the terminology has changed over time, what's appropriate and what's not. So you can't expect the conversation to ever come to an end, right? So that it's not, I get through this and I'm all better and we're all better, and
Lifelong learners.
Yeah, right,
and even a specific point of contention might not get resolved easily or ever, maybe, unless we keep the conversation.
And we know sometimes that as educators are very, very goal oriented. So they sometimes will have a goal in mind. It's like, it's hard for them to expect and to accept non-kosher. Because you didn't tell me what I'm supposed to do. You didn't get to where I thought you were going to get to today. So very good. We're not going to be able to fix it like that.
Yeah, I went with the concept that, we are all board members, we have our conversation, and vote, right? Like, there's
Yeah,
an
there
end
is a-
point
yeah.
that,
Yeah.
okay, now we're done with that, right? That's a whole different mindset.
Yeah. Good. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good perspective. How about speaking your truth?
So a couple things, knowing your truth, taking the time to kind of understand your truth and be comfortable with it so that you can speak it. We talked about the importance of speaking your truth so that whoever you're talking with can understand your experience and background and how things are affecting you and how you respond to react to things. But speaking your truth in as direct a way as possible. Sometimes, I get overly polite and kind of beat around the bush and no one ever knows what I'm saying. It's not at all direct. I'm trying to speak my truth, but they aren't getting it. But then, so be direct, but also speaking your truth in a way that's keeping the conversation open, so that it's not there's no judgment applied, or there's a way to speak your truth that keeps the listening and learning going. And I think those are some of the things that we talked about. What would you add?
Pretty much said everything we did.
We also think about speaking your truth is personal, so like I can't speak your truth. And a lot of times I think with teachers of color, if they're sitting in the room, it's really hard sometimes because you don't get an opportunity to speak your truth all the time. And when you do speak your truth, there may be some judgment because of what your culture brings and what is different from someone else's experiences. So to have that space where I can just speak my truth and know you've heard me is a wonderful place to be.
And this frankly is one of our challenges in the work, is that we will have schools with a single teacher of color. And it is very difficult to ask them to speak their truth in that space. And we regularly check in with teachers of color after the sessions because more than likely they aren't able to engage fully because of the nature of the conversations about race. And that's an ongoing challenge for us. We're always trying to figure out how we make this really powerful for them as well when it may not be safe.
How about assume positive intent and take responsibility for impact? Anybody want to understand what that's all about? What does that mean?
I think I'll tackle the first part a little bit, the assuming positive intent. I think that at the very beginning with our exercise of our guess who thing, right? I think don't want to talk about race from a place of, because we're not supposed to, and right, we're supposed to ignore that. So the intent is to be doing it right, if you will, and failing to account for the fact that talking about the race is an important thing. So I think you kind of, we have to assume that people are doing this work for the right reasons. I think we're all doing it for the right reasons. I made that assumption, right? And guess I'm big on taking responsibility for things, but I'm not sure what it means in this context. But I think, you know, I am very conscious of what I say all the time, and I'm super conscious of what I'm going to be saying today, right? Because I want to be improving myself in this process, because I know I have a lot of that bias in my head. I think about all the different things that happen, you know, on a day-to-day basis, and I want us to, in the end, improve ourselves so we can help the bigger picture improve and, you know, get to the heart of some of those inequities and
I think, even though I might intend, I have all kinds of positive intent, still think I might say might impact somebody in a way that's not positive. And I should take responsibility that even though I intended it to be, your experience was different, and I need to take responsibility for that. And then own that, not just own, well, I had positive intent, but this was your experience, and now I need to enter that. And even though I intended this to be positive, clearly it wasn't. And then I need to come back with that. And the responsibility piece is, so where's that disconnect? Where's the disconnect between I intended for this to be positive, but yet it wasn't received that way. So clearly, we don't fully understand one another. And my responsibility is that I don't fully understand you, even though I had a positive point or intent.
I think Cersei gave this as an example earlier about when we want to talk about people of color, when I say colored people. If I assume that you're coming from a positive intent, it will be easier for me to recognize, oh, he just, that was a slip of the lip, he didn't really need to say that. But it can't be just let go. I mean, because I heard it, I'm sure you heard it when you said it, so it's kind of like we got to clear the air. We can't just move on, put it under the rug like it didn't happen. So I either have to say to you, when you said that, it was offensive to me, or I don't know if you know you said that you switched the words around. I'm sure you didn't mean to do that. So there has to be some acknowledgement of that. And sometimes there's an apology needed. Sometimes that's necessary. I may say something that's just like totally off the wall, and if it's offensive, I need to have somebody tell me that. Because if I don't check it, if I don't recognize it myself, then it will go on as a hurt that happened in the room, and that doesn't move us where we want to go. So it's about holding our space.
So the responsibilities on both fronts.
Absolutely.
That's really, really key.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and as is assume positive intent.
Yes.
So if I say colored people, Ellen has some responsibility because we've agreed as a group, we're going there together.
Yeah, right.
Because we've agreed to that, it's her responsibility to say, ooh, ouch.
Yeah.
And for me then to say, I assume she just said ouch because she's caring about me. She's assuming I didn't mean bad. So I can say either, oh, yeah, ooh, I'm sorry. And then we can move on.
Right.
We don't have to dwell back here because we both just took responsibility and we both came from a
Yeah.
place of assuming positive
Yeah.
intent.
A little bit of speaking your truth in there too.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
yeah.
all these are.
Or it might be, what did I do? I don't understand what I said. Well, how is that hurtful?
Yeah.
And also, we hope that it's not just me and Ellen.
Right.
That we're all in it together. We're all going to help figure out
Yeah.
what did that mean and how is that hurtful, and take responsibility as a group.
I think we had that experience at one of our work sessions when we were talking about low-hanging fruit, and I said I just called it out, and it was something that we, like I said before, from the last board where when it was pointed out to us in the small group, and it just kind of stuck with me. And then as I heard it multiple times, like I didn't take responsibility to say something, but eventually I did. And then it was, I didn't know that what I was saying was offensive, so now I do. So.
Yeah, and we're able to take that and say, all right, you didn't mean it to be hurtful. We now all just learned something, and now we'll move on
Well,
and move
when I
forward.
said it, I didn't mean it, and I kind of felt that when I said it, I had no ill intent, but when I was corrected, I felt there was some ill
Sure,
intent.
yeah, because this is hurtful stuff.
Because it had been said many times and no one had said anything, and even Popular Mechanics had an article where they were using that statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when we don't have those kinds of norms, you probably left kind of feeling, here, I'm trying to do this work.
Well, agreed,
Yeah.
and exactly, and right, now we know it's a statement that it has a different connotation that I was unaware of, and now we're going on from that point.
Don't think we've heard it since,
But we haven't.
because we were throwing
But
it
it
out
is,
a
but
lot.
like I say, the Department of Mechanics had it a month later.
Sure.
And it's in an
Yeah,
article
It's a very
that's
common phrase.
a common
yeah.
phrase.
And we don't always know that, the racial history behind it.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. So at least as a group, we're gonna be like, we can't not say things. You know, that goes to, we're not gonna get anywhere if we feel like, if we say it, we're gonna hurt someone and we won't move forward as a board. We have to get it out there and we have to be able to have the conversations and figure out what are the words, what are the terms, those kind of things. Awesome. Okay, let's go ahead. We've got about 17 minutes before we're gonna take a break. So we wanna do another activity. I'm gonna, we'll share some of these. Oh, I didn't, here, I can just do this way. Update my. I'm skipping a bunch, and so I have to kind of refresh. We're going to move in then to thinking about implicit bias as a cognitive process and how that works. Oops, so Ellen has an activity.
So here's the activity. You're going to partner up again, and I'm going to read you some directions. See how good you are at following directions. All right.
And we'll split up partners, so you're not always with the same people.
Okay.
So you might want to choose a partner while I'm going.
So we'll just, like you two, and maybe you can come over here. Yeah, that'll mix it up a little bit.
All right. So, here are the directions. This is a partner activity, and you're going to hold your partner's hand like this, and each time one of you holds your partner's thumb down for 3 seconds, you receive a point. I will give you 60 seconds to complete the activity, and please keep track of the number of points you and your partner receive.
So this is thumb
Thumb
wrestling?
wars. This is, come on over here.
So to get started, you got 60 seconds.
You gonna give us the go? Minutes of time.
Yep,
So
yeah.
this is thumb wrestling.
So we're gonna
You
keep
described
track
thumb
of too,
wrestling
right?
too.
Yeah.
We have to keep track of how many we do.
No, I'll just, okay.
I can like,
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
You're being far too compliant, I think. Are we supposed to be not wanting to be held back?
1, 2 up to 4. 1, 2, 1, 3. Come on, man. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Okay. We're gonna stop.
Okay, that's right.
All right, so, how many of you competed?
Competed or
Competed.
completed?
Competed. How many of you competed when you were doing this?
I don't know what we were doing.
You just kept track of the numbers.
So-
How many points? How
We
many points?
competed,
How many
but I
points?
won 23 times.
Okay, how about you?
I don't think we could be.
It was 4 to 4 because it was pretty much one would win and the other one would just lie down and take it.
And how about you?
Yeah, it was, we sort of took turns. I mean, it wasn't really a competition. It was,
I kind of made it fun and
yeah.
tried to evade.
Okay. All right. So, do you think this was a competition or a cooperation type activity?
I felt it was competition, but Paul said it was cooperation, so I went along with it, and the results proved themselves out.
So you kept asking us, is this thumb wrestling?
Yes, I
And
did.
we refused to answer.
You refused to answer it.
Because it was a partner activity. These are
Correct.
the directions Ellen read to you.
Right.
Most people take it as thumb wrestling.
Okay.
Most people don't partner. Most people get maybe 2 or 3 points. Very few people do what you did, which is immediately 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Then you started to wonder, am I not doing what I'm supposed to do? So then we didn't have directions sharing. But there was a sense of what it means to do that activity. And what it means is thumb wrestling, and it means competition, and it means you only get a few points. Whereas what we said was it's a partner activity. We had partner how many times? 1, 2, 3, 4 times in the directions. So the idea here is that you had a mental model of what thumb wrestling was. And for most people, it doesn't matter what directions we gave them. They don't partner in it. Because to them, they know what we're asking them to do, when it wasn't what we were asking them to do. So that's the idea of a schema. And this is part of getting into the kind of cognitive processes that underlie our thinking. So a schema is a template of knowledge that helps us make sense of the world. All right? They're mental shortcuts. We make every day between 35 and 40,000 decisions. When we get up in the morning and get out of bed, we are deciding, am I going to put my foot on the floor and am I going to stand up or not? Do I know that the floor is there and it's going to be all of that? Those are all decisions we're making. We can't stop and think about every single of the 35 to 40,000 decisions we make. We simply can't. We have to have mental shortcuts that help us get through those decisions more automatically. So that's what schema do. They say to us, this is a chair. I know it's a chair. I can sit in this chair, and I can be pretty confident that this chair is going to hold me. I know what to do with this chair. I know whether it's, to come up to the table. I know how to turn it around. Like, I know what to do because I know it's a chair, so I don't have to walk in the room and say, what is this thing? What do I do with that? Where do I go? We don't know because we come right in and we do it. So schema are significant, and they're very, very important to allow us to get through the day. I wonder if I should get in. Let me give you a couple more examples, because I think what we want you to do is think about
Driving here today.
Driving here today, okay, share that one.
Driving here today, I mean, you have to start your car, you have to know when to brake, when to accelerate, turn signals, all those things. What would happen if you had to think about each one of those little steps? You probably wouldn't get out of your driveway, right?
You wouldn't be here.
Yeah, so DM had shared, red means stop, green means go. That's a schema that we have because we're drivers. So when we play red light, green light, if you have a 6-year-old who doesn't have that schema and they say, no, red means go. As an adult, her daughter did this, and she's like, I can't play this game. It doesn't work. That doesn't fit my schema. So it gets in the way.
An example of that, if I can just interject, is in Europe, yellow means something different. And so when I've driven in Europe before, it's like yellow here means you need to slow down. Yellow, and the order of the green, red, yellow is different there too.
Oh my.
It goes red, yellow, green, in that order instead of the opposite. So.
Yeah, so that it's helpful, it's important, and it can get in the way. So I have an example when I think of my brother. So I'm in the hospital, and I'm a patient, and I'm laying in the bed, and someone walks in and puts a stethoscope on my chest, which is a pretty private thing. I'm pretty vulnerable at this moment. How do I know whether this is okay for the stranger to come in and do that? What are the things that would make me feel, okay, I'm okay?
White coat with the name tag and the stuff, just the appearance of being a
There's
doctor.
a uniform.
Yeah.
They've got the scrubs, or the name
Yeah.
tag is another big one now that we've got stethoscope there. We know they're supposed to be there because, and those are cues and clues that help us not freak out, right? All right, what else am I thinking? Let's say it's my nurse has come in to do this. What else am I expecting, typically, if it's a nurse?
I would expect they have a code of ethics and they're not going to go tell everyone when they find out.
Yeah. Whoa, you should have seen that mole on that. Yeah. All right, yeah, some of that.
Gender?
I'm generally going to expect it's a woman, yeah. And if a guy comes in and does that, I'm going to expect he's the doctor, maybe a PA. And when I find out that it's a man, that he's a nurse, I'm likely to tell someone about it as, I had a male nurse. Not I had a nurse, I had a male nurse, because maleness doesn't fit my schema of nurse. So when something doesn't fit our schema, we got to figure out ways to make them fit. And it's things like descriptors like that. So natural and normal, and works and sometimes messes us up, sometimes trips us up, and that's when we realize we have a schema. Like, I didn't realize I had a schema that nurse equals female until I had a male nurse and realized it, or until my brother became a nurse. Heard his stories. So we want to have you think a little bit about some of the schema that you have as you walk through your day. What are those templates, shortcuts, things in your brain that allow you not to think and to move quickly through your day? So we've got some time to do some individual reflection, and then I'll invite you to share out, if you'd be willing, one or two of the schema you come up with. Maybe take about 10 seconds to maybe get one more.
Okay. So let's share out some of the things that you came up with, some of the schema you have for moving through your day. You want to start?
I can start. I'm sitting here thinking and realizing that most of my day is in meetings every day. I probably have 10 to 12 meetings a day.
Okay.
And the schema, I think, that helps me move through all of those really efficiently is that there's a certain set of expectations for how you conduct meetings. You kind of agenda, you've got someone who's facilitating, you kind of have whatever pre-read information that you need, you know what I mean? And I'm sorry, I mean, it's like this with our board meetings too a little bit, but I guess there's a schema around how to be, so you don't have to think about every meeting, like how do I do this? How do I get organized? How do we have a concrete discussion that helps us achieve the goals that we're after? There's a structure in place that we follow.
Okay. So if you were in a place and someone was doing something different than that, and they said it was a meeting, you would think, wow, this isn't familiar.
This isn't the meeting for me.
And it worked.
A chat or I don't know what it is. I would probably freak out, yeah.
Thank you. And you guys, in the shadow box, I don't know right now what you're hearing from other people. Just kind of think about those because they might help you to remember about schema. All right, would you like to share next?
Yeah, I guess I kept thinking a lot of mine was just centered around time, like or pattern, like I have to wear the same uniform to work, so I don't have to think about what I'm gonna wear. You know,
Okay.
get dressed, I just do it, and it's the same stuff.
So you're getting ready to go to work as a schema.
Yeah, and like I said, it's more about time, so like I know if I have to be, I work at a certain time, I have to take the interstate. If I, you know, I have to leave at a certain time to pick up my kids, so like my day is just time structured, I guess.
Okay. So we'll actually get to this also when we talk about the next part of processes, but part of what you're saying is you don't have to think about it. You know how to get to work.
Yeah.
There's that direction is in, and you don't have to decide every time, do I take North Dodge or
Yeah.
I-80?
Well, yeah, it's actually kind of funny because there's times when I'll go that way and I'm not going.
Not
that way.
meaning to, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about
I'm
that.
like, yeah, I'm just used to going this way as opposed to turning.
Could we get maybe one more person to share?
I got one, and it's sort of a managed schema, if you will. My wife and I, we're very regimented, but every Saturday, I go to the grocery store. Friday night, we plan our dinner meals for the next week, so I know what to do in the grocery store. When I come home from work, I make all the meals. And I share that as, it's how we do it every week. But if there is a night when we do not have it planned for dinner, we're gonna eat like an hour and a half later than we normally do, because we get paralyzed at, well, what the heck are we doing? And everybody tries to pull one way or the other to do it. So the plan of us planning out the meals makes it just, we eat at the, dinner time every night, because we've got a plan, and it's going to deviate, but it messes it all up.
I'd like to interject something. I know you said just one more person, but I think it's interesting as I hear the differences reflect a lot about, well, in Sean's case it was his family, but it's for Janet and Sean and Paul had a lot to do with their work. And for me, my work is very chaotic. I work in the emergency room, and any minute, a million things can change. So the kinds of things I have listed are more like, I know my car is going to run today. I know I'm going to have enough food for supper. I know I have a job and a house. And I'm thinking about more of the kinds of things that I deal with in my work, and how much of our schema has to do with just what we're doing. You know, how
What we don't have to then think about. Like I know that we've got food in the house, so I don't have to think right now about how am I going to get food in the house later.
And I think it's because in my work, I deal with so many people that don't have those things. And those are the people I'm seeing in the ER. There's lots of people in the ER that have these things, but they're not the ones I've seen. So, thank you.
Yeah, we have to think about that. And what I'm hearing is there's a little bit of there's routines and patterns and habits and processes that we choose to create. So we've chosen, here's how we're going to manage this process, which becomes a schema. Eventually it becomes such a part of that we really don't even have to think about it. But in the first step, it's not. It's not routine yet. It's not something that we engage regularly. And so you hope that eventually things become routine and habit, and then they become schema, and then you really literally don't have to think about them. They just help you make sense of the world and move on. So
Sometimes I'm just, this one thing, I have a schema. So I teach, and so I have a schema that students will listen to me. But that does get challenged all the time. But it's still the schema in my head, and when they don't, it's like,
whoop.
and I have to do like active cognitive things. So like, have my, how am I going to approach this? And now I work with lots of opposition kids, so I've got lots of other tricks, but every time I have to do that, it challenges my schema of, oh, like, you just disrespected me, like, they don't know the program, like, what's going on with this? And, but I find myself kind of running into that frequently, where I still have this schema in my head, but it's not even necessarily true, 40% of the time.
Well, mine was, when you're looking at what makes sense of the world, I had that I will always have the love and support of my family. Because I think, as far as how you get through the world, that's automatic. I know that's like the firmness of the earth. And another one that I had is that my faith, and I had in parentheses, God is always with me.
So what I like about those examples is that you could just, now that's there, you trust it, and you can move through your life and not think about it. But sometimes you probably do need to tend to it. Sometimes we need to stop and say, what do I need to do to make sure my family's still good? You know, so there are moments where you're gonna have to stop and think about your schema, even though most of the time you get to not have to worry about it, and it's part of the privilege we have engaging in the world. Yeah, that's really nice. All right, but we're a couple minutes over break time, so let's take a break, and can we please start right back at 1:45? Yeah, thanks. After having had an hour and a half of talk about race and
We're not gonna have near enough time.
how are you feeling?
I'm, actually, this sounds crazy, but maybe feeling a bit empowered that we create our norms and assume good intentions and speak our truth. I mean, we can practice that stuff. I feel good, actually.
You said this makes sound weird?
I don't know why I said that, but it's just, maybe it's, I don't know.
I think a lot of times you maybe were anticipating more discomfort or, and I also think that we've been thinking about these things for a long time in real deliberate ways and taking real deliberate action. And we've actually had conversations early on, just not around race, but just having norms and having with one another. So I don't know, but I'm feeling really positive.
Does having norms feel like something you do in a meeting?
We try to, but, I think the speaking truth conversation was helpful to hear and think about, and assuming good intentions, I think is just so important. And we're gonna need that, of course, as we look at our boundary work. We want our community to know that we have good intentions, and we'll make mistakes, and we want to have a dialogue. We want people to feel comfortable speaking their truth. And all that's just fantastic for the work that we're doing, that we can practice it amongst ourselves and model it. And I don't know, for me it feels exciting.
How about others?
I would throw out, I've participated in conversations about race, but I have never started. Because I've never known how to start a conversation, like always feeling awkward. And I feel that even just some of the kind of the icebreaker stuff at the very beginning of this is helpful for me to be confident in starting a conversation outside of here. And you know if you're going to have a conversation about race, it is going to be uncomfortable, and there's going to test some boundaries. And so it's really easy to, I'm not going to start it because I don't want that on my conscience, right? I'll let somebody else start it and we'll see what happens. But I feel a little more confident in at least trying to start a conversation. I really have no idea where I would go from there. So, I don't know, the next hour and a half or 15 minutes.
We'll figure it out, yeah.
Maybe a few more tools, but I feel it's helpful in that aspect for sure.
Would it be more comfortable if I were?
I don't think so. I think it's just being comfortable in my own skin, right?
Because I think that does change the dynamics a lot of times.
But you also know that we're here because we're here. We're here to engage. Ellen is here to be honest and open, and you're not always going to have that in a different
Yeah,
setting.
this is the safe space to do it, and everywhere else, you just never know.
Yeah.
But it's hard, what you're saying, Sean, I think is really powerful, because it made me have some discomfort just then, because I feel like I don't have the credibility to start a conversation about race as a white woman. Do you know?
Yeah, sure.
And so.
I want to come back to that. So remind me, I want to hear a little bit more how people are feeling, and then remind me right after that, I want to come back to that. How is everyone else feeling?
I'll say one thing that's occurred to me is, are we being recorded?
I don't know.
Yeah, we are. It's a work session.
So, exactly, but the thought occurred to me, like, I just want to point it out, I know that all of our sessions are recorded, but the thought occurred to me.
How does that feel?
When we think about like the part that you said, kind of like what happens here stays here, it's
Not
like
really.
really not so for us.
Yeah.
That's really not so.
So we can make that commitment to you, that when we go out and talk across the country, we're not gonna say, we might not even say the Iowa City School Board. We might just say, we've worked with the school board in a predominantly white state, and da-da-da-da. But you know there is a public record. So it does change how you engage.
And I also know that people can take things out of context.
Yeah.
And they do frequently.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah, I find myself getting more conscious of that as, you know, people say, oh, I listened to that thing, and then I'm like, oh. But at the same time, I've always been bad about filters anyway, and so it's, you know, to all of a sudden overcome that.
Yeah.
So I feel pretty free, although it crosses my mind. I mean, when we had the teachers here from Twain and Longfellow, part of me thought, we should tell them this is recorded. And then part of me thought, well, that might just be an intimidating way to say, don't speak your mind.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, it's like, well, is this fair? Because this is recorded.
Right.
So because I would rather not, I would rather pretend like it's not. And be able to have really frank, open conversations, because I feel that's more transparent. And any of that second guessing, I don't think will ever help, because people will take it out of context and people will choose to do that or not. But I feel those conversations where we're self-censoring are just not productive. And so, but it's a thing and it's real.
Yeah, I think, I guess I realized this since I've been elected, that when I sit in that seat up there, sometimes it's hard to, like Sean said, maybe start the discussion or talk about certain things because you think about how people are thinking about what you're talking about. Because the eyes are all on you. But then I think I also got to a point at some point where and I don't remember exactly when, but it was like, you need to make the right decision, not based on being reelected or how people are going to like. I think you just get enough positive and negative feedback that after a while you're like, you just have to feel confident in the decisions that you've made or whatever you set up there. So it's still a work in progress. I still feel like up there back here sometimes don't say what I'm thinking.
That makes sense. And that's very real. So what we've tried to do is create a holding environment to have these conversations in this space, in this professional community right here. We do that with the teachers in the schools, we do that with the principals, with the central office when we're there, and we can make different kinds of assurances about anonymity and confidentiality when we're in their spaces that we can't actually make here. That's very true.
And there are people who are working a job, and we all chose to be elected. So we've made a decision to be public, and so that's, I think, part of the sacrifice. And what we're doing here, we don't have to do this training,
Right.
but we're doing, I think we're modeling, and then hopefully to go forward so teachers can absolutely feel like it's anonymous and they can have real conversations. And because us having these understandings are not as important as classroom teachers having these understandings, because they're the ones that are in front of kids every day that are going to impact those kids. I like that we're doing this, and hopefully if we can do this in public, recorded, then people may feel better about doing it in a more private setting than they might have.
And all these community sessions that we're having, what we're learning here, I mean, because I agree with you, teachers are so critical because of their role every day for the students, but as we're facilitating these community conversations about race matters in our schools, us understanding our own biases and the word choice and all the things that we're doing are super important.
So you don't typically in meetings here in the U.S. get to talk about how you're feeling. This compass is provided as a tool for having interracial conversations about race. This comes out of Courageous Conversations About Race by Pacific Educational Group. The first 4 norms we gave you come out of their work. They are the agreements that they have everyone engage in together as they engage in that kind of work. What this just very quickly says to us is, if we're having real, authentic conversations about race, we're going to be thinking, we're going to be feeling, we're going to probably be doing, and at some point we're going to be believing. And if we aren't honest about going in all of those spaces in these conversations, we're not doing the work really. We're not being authentic about where we are in the work. So they offer this compass as a tool to be able to say, we tend to stay in the intellectual. We tend to stay in thinking. If we have a meeting at a school where we're doing professional development, usually it is in this intellectual space. What does the research tell me? How do I put this into practice? We'll move into the acting. What do I do in the classroom tomorrow? Very quickly we'll move over to there. So we stay on that side. We don't often go in the, is this counter to my core values and beliefs? Or does it mesh with my core values? What are my core values and beliefs? Am I really able to do what you're asking me to do? Because it might be counter to my belief is we should be colorblind, for example. That's why we started having that conversation, because folks enter it believing they should not notice race. And we're asking them to talk about race, so we gotta deal with that tension that they feel. It also can bring up emotion. It can be very difficult. It's hard to acknowledge. I'm feeling kind of bad here. I'm feeling kind of called out. I'm feeling like you told me I'm racist and that makes me hurt. I'm about to cry right now. Or goodness sakes, maybe I will. We tend not to go there in professional settings. So what we're trying to do is say, we do need to be over here, we also need to be over here, and we need to be intentional about acknowledging it and talking about it. Because ultimately, we should really be in the center, where we're really able in a group to attend to all of that. So what we'll literally do, we don't do it in this project so much because we just don't have time to introduce it, but if we had more time, we would have the compass and we'd say, all right, let's pull out the compass, where are we? Where have we been in the last 10 minutes? And we do a little bit of a tally. Where have we been? We've been over here. Who's in their own space been over here? And invite that into the conversation. Because that's part of how we get people to, we're asking people to examine their thinking, the thinking that they don't even control. That's pretty hard, pretty tough to do. There's a lot of barriers to go in there. And if we don't allow them to talk about what's in my way, we can't get there with them. So I'm sharing this with you because I wanted you to know why I asked that question. That it actually is part of a real strategic process of creating these kinds of conversations. Okay. All right, now we'll go back to the head. We'll go back to the intellectual. I have a little bit of research to share.
I really like that compass though. I really like
It's
that
a
one.
powerful tool, definitely. Yeah. All right, so back to schema. There's been research on schema. We understand schema help us get us through our day. We're recognizing sometimes we get tripped up when things don't fit with the schema that we have. We also want to share that we know schema can lead to errors. We can have errors in the cognitive process based on the schema that we have. So this is a particular study where they were looking into that and they were trying to see what was going on. And this is one that's around gender. So in this particular study, the researchers showed photographs of men or women, a man or a woman, either standing next to a door or maybe sitting in a chair. And they would show a couple different photos, and then they would ask the subjects to estimate the height of the subjects in the photos. Okay. So there's a reference point in all of them. It's the same chair or the same door that they're standing next to. And the models are the same height. So the men and women in the photographs are all the same height. So they're asked to estimate, you can probably guess. Can you guess what kinds of findings they generally had? So, yeah, oops. Yeah, they overestimated the height of men and underestimated the height of women. Why? I mean, just to really unpack it and be transparent. Why do you think that happens?
Because that's the norm. Men are taller than women.
I
We
think-
have, yeah.
I was thinking when you first put that out there, that was right where my first thought went, was probably that men were taller than the women were. And then I was thinking about why that was, and I think like a lot of relationships, that's how
Mhm.
people are. It seems like there was always this thought like I can't date a person that's taller than I am if you were a woman or whatever it was, you know, that was just like the,
That was your schema about
Yeah.
what it should look like when you date.
Yeah.
Well, and what it does. So the evidence would demonstrate men are typically taller than women. We've got evidence to back that up. Yep. Mhm. Even in these cases where they weren't. So we are based on some evidence that we have and some patterns we notice in relationships. Men tend to be equal to or taller than women because there's probably some cultural things going on about who we pair up and why, and what it means to be a short man compared to a tall woman, that kind of stuff. You're nodding your heads like that makes some sense. All right. So we got evidence, and yet in the face of evidence, we make a mistake. We rely on the schema to inform our memory of what we saw. rather than to look at the data, look at that reference point. To know we had a door and I could have looked at that, you know, when you walk out 7-Eleven and they've got the how
Yes.
tall are you kind of thing. Well, they do that for a reason because we're not good about doing that. We will misremember men as being taller than women. Because that's what our schema tell us to do. So the schema can be really helpful, but they also can get in the way. And even in the face of evidence, they can get in the way. Our thumb partner exercise. Too often, the schema in our mind is thumb wrestling. People are competing. It's not a partner exercise. So even though we gave them directions, they don't follow the directions because their schema took over. And that's normal, but it's sometimes unhelpful. And how it can be really unhelpful is when it stems from these stories we tell that are often from unhelpful spaces. There's narratives we have that kind of get in the way of being able to remember things as they are in our actual experience as compared to how we think of them or remember them or interpret them or observe them. All right, so we have a little exercise. This is a little bit of a tough setup. We were debating when do we do this exercise, so we're going to do it right now. I'm going to write down some of the stories we tell, or hear, some of the stories we hear, let's say, about students who are from Chicago. All right? And because we're talking about race, I'm going to start with, what are the stories we hear here in Iowa City about black students from Chicago? Okay? That's not a good marker. So I would love for you to just throw out stories that we tell, and really for purposes of recording, these are stories we're hearing in our community, not necessarily ones we tell. Okay, so what are some of the stories we hear about black students from Chicago?
Disrespectful.
Disrespectful,
Behavior problems.
behavior problems. What else?
I think we're incentivized to come here by landlords who are looking to get easy. Yeah. Looking to get unit.
So they're coming here for housing and they're poor enough to be on Section 8. We're hearing that, okay. What else?
They're violent.
Violent? What else?
They're escaping violence.
Escaping violence, okay. Talk about more about what you hear about why they came. We've got, they came here for housing, they're escaping violence.
Generational poverty.
Generational poverty. Okay.
Other family members that are already here.
Uh-huh. Where in Chicago are they from?
The south side of Chicago.
It would be just inner city versus suburbs.
Yeah, when you say students from Chicago, it depends if you're talking about University of Iowa students from Chicago. Or
Okay, we're talking about black
I
students
know,
from
I know, I
Chicago.
know.
Any other stories we hear about black students from Chicago?
That they don't start school on time. They wait till after Labor Day.
Intellectually behind.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't-
Yeah.
Intellectually behind. What else around that?
Don't care about school
Don't care about
or
school.
prioritize it.
Don't care about prioritize. Okay, what else?
Truant or tardy. Frequent.
All right, anything else?
Maybe families that aren't as involved in the school.
Just say the family member's not involved, is that what you said? Okay. Ellen, I think you can put it in the,
On that side.
maybe on that side. All right, what else?
Single parents, single
Single parents,
mothers.
single parents, single mothers.
Yeah.
All right,
Fathers in prison.
okay. What else?
these are things you hear, but there's probably images that come to mind, certain ways of dress that are, sagging pants, hoods up.
Any others?
Gang affiliation.
Also though, strong church affiliation.
Mhm. Anything else? All right. What about the stories we hear about white students in Chicago?
From the suburbs. I mean, I think universities.
Affluent.
Yeah.
I'm here for,
I'm just saying, joking, I don't hear stories of white students.
The only-
Okay.
It's the university kids.
I hear about
Yeah.
university students from Chicago.
Yeah. me too.
I don't hear about white students in our
Well, they come here because our college is cheaper than Northwestern.
or cheaper than
University of
Illinois.
Or Illinois schools.
Our out of state is cheaper.
They're coming here for economic reasons.
That's hard.
working at the hospital, they have residents and doctors that come. So the assumption is that they're wealthy or will be wealthy in the profession that is wealthy.
Where
So
from
professional
Chicago
people,
are
I
they?
guess. Yeah,
Where from Chicago are they?
Yeah, suburbs.
So they came for college or work. Oh, we've already got that, I see what you're saying. Anything else about white students? What about their educational background or their educational ability?
Not behind.
Is that all? If this is part of, is it just that they're not behind? And maybe it is,
I don't hear
or
that
maybe it's not a
they're.
part of the story.
Yeah, it just doesn't come up. It's just not.
Well, they're not coming here for career and technical.
Yeah, I mean, they're here, if they're college students, they're clearly already college, I mean, that's, they're already college students.
Oh, you're talking about the students in the district.
Well, but they're, then I'd say what Sean said, you don't hear about white students from Chicago in our public school.
So either you don't hear about them, or you hear about them in relationship to college.
Exactly.
There's still a schema around white students from Chicago,
Mhm.
one way or another. Whether we hear it in K-12, you hear it. We know it's there. It informs our thinking. That's, I think, the kind of point we're trying to get at.
Yeah.
There is a schema about what it means to be black and from Chicago. And look how rich and complex that story is that we hear about kids from Chicago who are black.
Okay, I would say if you have white students who come into the district at all, it's not that they're from anywhere. You don't, you just don't have, they're just like the other white students in our,
So we don't even ask necessarily where
You're
they
here
came
because your
from.
parents work at the university, which means they're probably the professors, I mean, that's.
Yeah, because if you have a black student coming from West Branch, there's something different from somewhere not.
Yeah, so you're still gonna wonder once removed. It's not enough that they just came from West Branch, you're gonna wanna know where were they before that, this is different. So assumptions are part of what we're gonna be examining and exploring together. What about Latinx students from Chicago? What's the stories we hear about Latinx students from Chicago?
Hardworking.
Hardworking.
Language
Families that don't speak.
difficulties.
Language.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that this is necessarily from Chicago, but I've heard Latinx students' parents described as being really concerned about behavior problems in the classroom, really tuned into behavior.
But I think to touch on it, I think that maybe it's an assumption is that if you're being deported or getting in trouble, Thus, they try to stay out of trouble.
Could be.
Yep, that and I would say that's an assumption for Latinx, is that they're,
Immigration.
somehow they're involved in immigration or worried about their immigration status is a
Or
factor.
they're not.
Exactly.
Well, this is just an inter-family thing, because they're from Waukegan.
So there's
But,
regions in Iowa?
There's a ton of
that are-
Beletians in Waukegan. I think what the stereotype of Waukegan was is it was Poles at one time, or that was dominant, and now it's a lot of Beletians in Waukegan.
Specific community, Waukegan, I don't know if I'll spell that right.
You're doing a good job.
Other things? Now notice, we've got stories about Latinx students. I'm not sure, let me check. Is it that they're from Chicago?
Mhm.
We actually don't have a mental model about Latinx students from Chicago. It's not a story we hear. We very much have, you were fast, you just jumped right on that. You didn't pause or hesitate. We very much have mental models or schema about black students from Chicago. White students at the university from Chicago, we again have that, but not so much white students generally. Latinx students, very much, we've got some schema about them, not necessarily from Chicago.
I would say, frankly, from Mexico, I would say that's
Or
the
Central
schema, and that
America.
most people make that assumption, or they'll just use the word Mexican to be interchangeable with Latino Americans.
Why did they come here? What's some of the story about why they came here?
Yeah, that they're
What
working
kind of
at
jobs?
a plant.
University? No?
Well, university if they're doing housekeeping, or, yeah, that's,
But in, agricultural, I mean.
yeah, Tyson,
Yeah.
Working on farms.
Maytag,
Roofing,
roofing, construction.
Yeah, seriously.
construction and roofing.
Yeah. Mhm.
Down
All right, let me just keep going while we're at it. We have 4 major categories of students in the district that we really easily can talk about because the data don't start to get individually identifiable. So the other major categories are Asian students. So let's just talk about first, do we have a schema for Asian students from Chicago?
No,
Not from Chicago.
Pretty
Not
much
from
everyone
Chicago.
not from Chicago. All right, but we do have a schema about Asian students. What would be in that?
they're smart.
Smart.
Parents are doctors or professors, you know.
value education.
Okay, what else?
Very high expectations,
Okay.
like coming from the home,
Yeah.
pressure to perform well.
The tiger mom.
It's a multi-talented, music,
Yeah.
academia.
Math,
Well,
science,
but
robotics.
music-
But music, I think.
Not football.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Multi-talented, music,
But
STEM,
tennis. You can play tennis or golf.
not football,
Not football,
At
basketball,
West Side.
baseball.
no baseball, basketball, yeah.
Okay.
But
Well, but I
Mexico,
think-
I think you think West Side.
These are
Oh,
the,
that's
I mean, this is
good.
Well,
what we
because-
believe
well,
necessarily.
and it's because of the recent success that, one or two students have.
But I think just in general, when you take Asian,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think you take the West.
Although I will throw in an
Look at the
example
merits
of,
college, right?
and there's a family at St. Mary's that has 2 adopted Asian children.
Mhm.
One is that stereotype.
Mhm.
They're in it's in the same family, same mom, same single mom with 2 Asian students. One is smart, sharp, very, she's reading now from the lector. She does readings, and she's a 7th grader. She has projects at the state fair, excels, a gymnast, and very musically talented. She has a sister, a year older, that's just an average kid.
Mhm.
But they're both Asian, and they're both in the same family, so.
So we've got some counter stories. in
Well,
there.
yeah, right, so
Yeah.
there is something to it, but boy, the one you would just look at, and it's like, you could check off every single one of those and say, yep, she fits them all.
I would say that also, when we think about Asian students that are on free and reduced lunch, we assume that they are children of graduate students.
So they are, and there's still a different.
It's just a
Poverty
temporary.
means something different.
It's not generational poverty.
And we're, yeah, working towards a really good professional job.
And this has really changed too, and I guess I'm old enough to remember when the Vietnamese, and I don't know if this was in Tipton, the same thing, that was kind of our first introduction to Asian students that came into our schools. They couldn't speak a word of English. They were thrust into a completely different culture and language, and it was extremely difficult for them, and their families were of very meager means. None of them were rich, and they were getting in and just starting off. And I can remember very distinctly, because we had a very a student population that was pretty much all the same, and then this was introduced, and gosh, it had to have just been just a completely amazing challenge for them, with no other successful students, peer examples or anything to go with.
I don't know how many of you experienced that. I was in high school in Tipton, and what's interesting to me is I do this work. I've been about 15 years ago when I started doing my racial autobiography out loud to people. I would say I was in a 100% white community, and then after the first or second time, I thought, well, until I was a senior, at which point we had Vietnamese boat people come in, which is what we called them, and then we had 3 kids in my high school. 1 was my age, and what was interesting to me is that I didn't count them as being in our community. So I could say we were 100% white when we really weren't.
Correct.
We really were not 100%. And now, my son grew up, went to City High, and his best friend is the son of one of the women that were in, she was in Minneapolis, so
Okay.
a different community, but same
Right.
time, same church, I think, that brought them in. So a very different, and yet I was able to compartment, and I do race work. I mean, I facilitated work about race, being honest about my whiteness, and I'm like, yeah, and I just had them over here. They didn't fit my schema of being from Tipton. And I wasn't from Tipton, so I knew what it meant to not be, like, it's crazy how we do these things.
Well, and you're not from Tipton unless you have relatives
Exactly.
in the cemetery. It's the same.
Exactly,
Yeah.
that is exactly right. Yeah,
It's
and I
terrible.
didn't, so
Rural,
yeah.
rural
Yeah.
Iowa
Yeah.
is you're not from there unless you can trace back generations.
Yep, so our schema are
Iowa
powerful.
City has a little of that too, I think.
Iowa City does have, there's something about being a
But
townie.
in West Branch, we had a science teacher that said the kids were getting smaller because it was getting so inbred.
Oh,
Oh, jeez. Okay. I'll just say ouch and
Well,
leave it
yes.
alone from there.
Well, I have to go there. The guy was a phenomenal instructor, but he did make that statement one time that the kids were getting smaller.
So I think part of our point of talking about this is that there's a lot of points about this, but the schema inform how we make sense of the world and the decisions that we make, and especially the decisions we make fast. Because we got to make decisions in schools fast. You are in the middle of a conversation with a child or a classroom of 26 children, and things happen, and you've got to figure out how am I going to respond. And probably some of these characteristics match some of the black children in your class who are from Chicago. So you probably, as a teacher, have some evidence that actually, I know that this student came because I talked to the parent and parent-teacher conference, and believe it or not, they had a conversation with me about where they live, and I happen to know that it's Section 8 housing. So I have some information about this student. Unfortunately, that means all this other stuff gets filled in. And I may know one piece, I may not know. Frankly, if I knew that, it would be a huge surprise to me if teachers actually knew that about their individual students. Because that stuff doesn't come up in parent-teacher conferences very often. All right, but they might know they live in the trailer court. That may come up. You might know that. So that's a common one we hear. Well, they're from Breckenridge. Oh, that has a whole story behind it. And the fact is, any one student probably doesn't fit more than 2 or 3 of these characteristics, but we bring them all to the interactions that we have with kids. And that's where we start to encounter implicit bias. We don't mean to do this. We may have the best of intentions. We may truly love all of our children. As teachers, we may really want them all to succeed. And in the moment when we're making decisions about instruction and about discipline and about the climate we create in our classroom, we get informed by these stories that we don't even believe necessarily, or that we joke about in mixed company when we're, can you believe people have these stories about these? But they're there, and we are influenced by them. So that's basically the idea of what implicit bias is. It is, there we go. Attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So they're going on behind the scenes and they're impacting us implicitly, not explicitly. Often they are counter to our explicit beliefs. We could truly believe in egalitarianism. We are all equal and we are all of equal worth and value. And then we get into a situation where we're informed by, yeah, but, and we've got all these other stories that influence the way we then act, counter to our own beliefs. Which is part of why I'm so comfortable assuming positive intent. Because I actually, the more we talk with teachers, the more we believe they have explicit values that I really, I'm like, yeah, go. And they're influenced by all of this. And we're influenced by all of this. So when we're in conversations at the board table and someone's talking about discipline, we're influenced by these stories too. So part of what we're asking people to do is think about that. How are we influenced by the stories that we hear? So let me play this video for you. New York Times did a real nice series of about 4 or 5 short videos on implicit bias. And this is kind of their intro video.
Implicit bias?
Implicit bias. Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
All right, so we share this with folks and we try to use this metaphor of the fog. That we have this fog that we're encountering all the time and it gets in our way and influences what we do and how we think. And so our task is to see the fog and try to get it to dissipate. try to get through, clear our way through the fog. One thing I really like about the fog metaphor is that happens, fog shows up, I'm driving here, it's hard to see, day comes, it goes away. Next day it comes back again. And that's the way implicit bias works. We got stories that we hear, we can start to unpack them, identify them, start to clear it out of the way, and then some new stories start cropping up. So it's kind of this continuous process of learning how to problematize the stories that we hear and the impacts they have on us. So it's never an ending thing, like, okay, now we figured this out, now we're really not ever susceptible to these stories again. Well, it's not that easy, number one, and number two, it'll be a new story. There'll be a new way we're going to talk about race that we have to problematize and think through. Okay? So let us give you, I'm going to skip this as another one of the processes that works and move into a couple of ways that we see this play out then. What does research show is the impact of implicit bias. Do you want to do the legal memo or do you want me to?
Sure. The legal memo is a research article, a piece of research that involved law partners, and there were 60 partners and 20 law firms. And so what they did was they were supposed to be reviewing a legal memo and from a hypothetical third-year student. So the memo had some embedded errors in it. And the other thing they did was they did the memo so that the only difference was the racial identity of the hypothetical person that was doing the memo. So the person's name was Thomas Meyer. Thomas Meyer was an African American, Thomas Meyer was Caucasian. Both of them were third-year associates, and they were from New York University Law School. So what they noticed in the legal memo, remember there were some embedded errors. The errors that they found among the African American person whose name was Thomas was 5.8 out of 7. Out of 7, there were 5.8 errors found. And on the Caucasian side, there were 2.9 of those 7 errors found. Overall rating, you can see what those are. So there was a discrepancy in those two just based on the ethnicity of the person, race or ethnicity.
So does that make sense? The associate or the partners are supposed to rate the quality of this memo and this clerk.
In addition, they made comments about the two. And for the African American, Thomas Meyer, the comments were like, he needs lots of work, can't even believe he went to NYU.
It's the same memo.
It's the same memo, but just
Same name.
saying everything, just identified as
Really
African. And then the other one, generally good writer, but needs to work on, has great potential, good analytical skills, just based on the race or ethnicity of the person, same number.
So this is what they call confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think we are looking at an African American sample of writing, we are more prepared to search for errors because we have a schema in our mind of their capacity. I think it came up here about the black students are of lower academic skill. So that comes with it, and we find more of the errors, and therefore we judge them differently. Whereas if we only think there's 2.9 on average spelling and grammatical errors, sure, we think they're, generally a good writer, maybe a little bit of that sort of thing. So it plays itself out in very insidious ways, is what we're seeing in the research. So what we're doing then is taking this understanding of bias and how it plays itself out and looking at our disciplinary disproportionality. So that's a big area of concern that you've been talking about a lot. And the hypothesis is implicit bias may be a root cause of disciplinary outcomes that are disproportionate. And you've looked at the data and that sort of thing. We can, at another time, do some of that. But basically, we see, especially between white and black students, a tremendous disproportionality is what you expect from their population. So far more students are disciplined at black than white at rates.
Just a quick question, I'm
Yeah.
sorry,
Please.
with that example, just looking at like a classroom setting. So if you have an instructor, they get the paper, they know the one student is black, they know the one student is white. would it be better if you just had a number on the paper and you had even a teacher in another classroom evaluate?
So when we do, we're not gonna get into a lot of that
Oh, okay,
strategies
I'm
today,
sorry.
but exactly, yes, there are strategies you can use. So part of it is you need to know the student as a teacher, you need to know their fullness of, you need to know that, and sometimes you gotta check yourself.
Sure.
So it's absolutely a way to do some blind grading, collaborative grading. You're right on where some of the teachers were moving as they were seeing this. So we could really do some of these activities we've talked about as good teaching can actually be activities when we put that lens race on them, make even more sense for us. Because that kind of stuff
You can
plays
get
out.
that with a favorite kid or not. I mean,
Sure, right.
Yeah.
regardless of
Yeah.
races, you
Yeah.
have a bias, I get it.
Right.
And give them the benefit of the doubt,
Mhm.
because, yeah,
You
they're
know
all
their
way
parents or,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll talk more about that, through that when we get to achievement. So. Good, awesome, all right. You know, with the small group, we kind of thought, I don't know if the discussion will go as well. You guys talk so much. We're way off on my time. So you can see it, which is totally cool and awesome. But a room of 30 people don't quite get as much of a chance to engage. So I'm going to fly a little bit fast through some of this, and then we'll pause down. So we want to think about using implicit bias as a lens. So as we're looking at our data, as we're looking at our practices, as we're looking at our policies, we want to take a disciplined approach to examining how bias might come into play, and thinking really about how I can reflect on my own presumptions. So part of what we're offering is how we're doing this with teachers, because I think you need to know that. Ultimately, I want you to think about how this affects you as policymakers, because that's really your role, and we're all in this. How can I reflect on how students and families might experience the school, and how can I reflect on what I think about students and families as I'm setting policy? So this is another study now as we move into discipline. So there are a lot more, the past 5 years has really been a boom for research on implicit bias, which has been exciting. Not all of them have been in schools, so some of this won't be schools, some of it will. This is one that was. Researchers at Yale had been collecting national data on discipline practices in preschool. And they were looking particularly at suspensions. And they started disaggregating the suspensions by race. And they started seeing that while black children are only 20%, about a fifth of the students in preschool, they were nearly half of the suspensions. So as they're seeing this nationally, they're like, something's going on. Something is really a problem here. What's going on in preschool? And you can imagine people will say have lots of ways to explain this. The most predominant one is right here. Well, they're disrespectful, their behavior problems, they're violent. That is the evidence we have, that's true. That's why it's disproportionate, because they act out more. So they wanted to say, certainly, that could be. So then we want to ask questions, why? We want to go down that path, or maybe not. Maybe we've got some bias underlying here. So they did a study where they took teachers, preschool teachers, and they gave them a video on a computer screen, and they had them wear glasses that tracked their eye movement. And they said to them, I want you to watch for misbehaviors and note when there are misbehaviors. There was a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And what they did is tracked who were they watching. And this is what they found, that black boys were 25% of the population, they watched them 42% of the time. White boys altogether, they watched boys 3/4 of the time when they were primed for misbehavior. Now, I don't know about you, I had 2 kids in preschool. My daughter was the one that bit, it wasn't my son. But she would get away with it most of the time because they weren't even watching her. So that's what they were trying to say is, could there be something underlying this other than actual student behavior? Could we just be noticing it more? And they were finding that, yeah, it's probably pretty likely that we're watching kids differently. And therefore, we're taking actions. And then that creates a kind of spiral effect. All right,
Yeah,
so
but going by that too, the black girls were the least watched.
yeah,
Which
least
is,
watched.
that's wouldn't go along with your thinking if typically.
The stereotypes we have of black girls
Right.
is what? They're loud, they're disrespectful.
Well, okay,
It is a stereotype that
Okay.
we hold as a nation,
all right.
and that our evidence are when they do studies on what we understand black girls to how they engage. That's a stereotype. That we
Well,
hold.
and our data would say it. certainly our own district data.
But with the eye tracking, it goes against.
It goes against that, isn't that
it.
interesting?
Right.
So maybe something's happening differently with preschool than when
Sure,
they're
okay.
in middle school.
That's where
Yeah.
our one was age.
Is it age related? Yeah. Great questions. These are the questions you can ask when you start having some data in
Yeah.
front of you. So what is going on? What is that happening? How is it playing out? And what are the implications of it? All right, here's another one. This one, there's been a lot in policing, as you can imagine, because we certainly have been, hopefully, I think we have been attending to the potential for bias in policing a lot and doing some research. And Philip Atibe-Goff is a really powerful researcher doing a lot of work with police departments to overcome implicit bias. So in this particular case, they had photographs of Black, Latino, and white boys of all the same age, and they showed them to police officers. And they were asking them to estimate the age of the boys. So like before we were saying estimate the heights, now we're going to estimate the age. And they would randomly say, this is a child who's been charged with a felony, or this is a child who has been charged with a misdemeanor. So there was a little bit of priming. You might notice we didn't get into it, but there's a little bit of priming on the preschool study. Watch for misbehavior. That's priming you to do something. So they're priming them differently here. So what they found is, when they thought the youth were charged with a felony, they overestimated the age of the black boys by about 5 years.
Wow.
And when they thought it was a felony, they underestimated the age of white boys by nearly a year.
Huh.
So if it was a 12-year-old, they thought the black boy was 17 and the white boy was 11. So our question we pose is, what if this is happening in our schools? What might that mean for our disciplinary decisions? So think about that. What might it mean? What if it's happening? What if is a good question we like to ask. What if? It might not be happening. What if it's happening? What do you think?
Well, you're definitely going to expect better behavior from a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old,
Mhm.
and expect more responsibility for behavior. And certainly then more of a 17-year-old compared to an 11-year-old if they're both 12. And even though, maybe as a teacher, your students are all the same age, but you could have these underlying assumptions of, yeah, you look.
Yep.
And when the 17-year-old does something wrong compared to an 11-year-old, you're going to be harsher. and
Right.
disciplined.
Yeah, you're going to be treating them more like an adult. And 17-year-olds have more cognitive development than 12-year-olds. And still not as much as a 25-year-old.
So in our classrooms, in the moment, when we're doing all of this stuff informs these moment-to-moment decisions we're making around discipline, because we got lots of kids we're dealing with, we got to make some quick decisions, even if we know the child, even if we know that they're 12, we still are influenced by this tendency and make some disciplinary choices as a result. So what we're trying to think about is, what are the ways we can slow down and stop and disrupt that kind of response that we have. Philip Goff says he's really thinking about it in the sense of who needs protection and who is innocent, who gets the benefit of seeming to need our protection and being innocent, as compared to who we presume is essentially a danger to our classroom. And so we know from this story already, the very first things we heard is we presume that these black children from Chicago are a danger to our classroom. We're going to overestimate their maturity level, assume they know what they're doing and that they should be more responsible than maybe they really are. And we do that without thinking. And I skipped the sort of system 1 and system 2 processing, but it talks about how we make fast decisions. And we got to make fast decisions based on unconscious processes most of the time. And most of what we have to do in schools are pretty fast decisions. It's pretty unique to be able to stop and
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Get all the information.
Right. Do you want to share, this severity of discipline study?
And I think I heard you say something about harsh discipline. There were 2 students at a fictitious middle school, and the students misbehaved twice. The same students misbehaved twice. Teachers were asked how they would proceed and respond to the infractions, and the only difference was their names. Again, students Deshaun or Darnell versus Jake or Craig. So, different names.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that, 'cause I'm on-
Okay, so from the first to the second infractions, teachers are likely to escalate the disciplinary response. Again, if you're thinking that you're dealing with a kid who is 17 versus a kid that's 12, you know better. You're not gonna get the slap on the wrist the second time. This is malicious, there's a pattern here. Whereas with the white student, it's believed like, oh, you goofed up again, like we gotta get you together on this. But the infractions by the black students are most likely to be viewed as connected, so there's a pattern. So when you see a pattern, what do you do with your discipline? You're right? So where do these biases come from?
specifically around discipline.
Media.
You know, maybe just a different understanding of what respect is and looks like, and what is disrespectful, like.
So there may be cultural
Differences.
real cultural differences.
Stereotypes.
Stereotypes.
We have an article that we share, I'll send you a link to it, by Stotts at the Kurland Institute at Ohio State University, where they look at implicit bias very directly and specifically. And one of the things she said is she does a bit of a review of the research that really does talk about this implicit association we have between people of color, in particular men of color, and danger and that sort of thing. And so we had this example, and you may remember when this happened in 2015 here in Iowa City, where we had two burglaries relatively recent, close to one another in occurrence, and this is what the Gazette had shown. And they got called on it, and there's been some stuff written about it, and I can send you those links as well. But we see the images here, and one thing we share this as kind of a where does it come from and how is it reinforced? This has kind of got two sides to the coin. So what do you think? How does that to you sort of connect to this idea of where these biases come from out of these images?
Well, you've got mug shots and you've got
Athletic photos.
Yeah,
You got, photos out of the wrestling
Because all three of those
program.
guys have shots taken.
Of course they did.
And the Iowa, or the white men are described as wrestlers.
Oh, the wrestlers.
They're
Not
not
just this generic
Four.
Four, right. Right, which is even just a number, it's not even a person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really dehumanizing.
Dehumanizing, yeah.
and also.
And it's pending, you know, and
Yeah.
investigation
Yeah.
is like, yeah, but I tell you, myself, and this is I'll give my own bias, when I see an athlete doing something, first thing that comes to my mind is you should hold yourself to a higher standard and example. I think of the Niall Kinnick thing. Every time I see something with an athlete, I go to, okay, there's a guy, won the Heisman, best athlete, went into the Navy and was buried at sea, trying to serve his country. And whenever I see someone who is kind of in that same situation, I try and hold them and that's, but I'm going into too far. But that's it. But yeah, no, that is just reinforcing absolutely wrong stereotypes, and we get it too much and all the time.
Yeah.
Too much and all the time.
So I lived in Washington DC for 15 years, and 7 of those years was in a very challenged inner city neighborhood. And I learned that as a white woman, I was relatively safe because they weren't about to touch the white girl. Because you touch the white girl, the police are there, like, it's just bad news. So I'm actually going through that experience, I was relatively safe. So if I woke up and my house was being burglarized and I come across the men on the right, I pretty much expect they're gonna get the hell out of there. Whereas these guys, who knows? And I know they're wrestlers, they know how to take me down. Like, who am I more scared of? Honestly, I'm gonna be more scared of here. But if I see these images, What's being reinforced is I should be more scared over here. And so even in my own head, I've got evidence in my own lifetime that are counter to it, but I'm susceptible to. So this is both part of how it gets reinforced, but it's also part of how it plays out. What's happening? We're on a deadline, we gotta get some stuff up. We had a little trouble maybe getting the mug shots and so I'm gonna slap up this thing because we gotta do these pictures. And this is what happens. I'm making fast decisions as an editor, and I don't have a filter. I don't have a filter that says, stop, wait, what am I projecting here? And so they got called on it, and then when they got called on it, they explained, here's what happened, and one was county and one was city, and we get mug shots faster from one. Okay, fine, there's a decent explanation, but I would have hoped there would have been someone that said, now wait a minute, let's think about what we're doing. And I do hope that and I've talked with actually some of the folks at the Gazette about this, and it's a challenge. How they handle images is still a problem, and it's a challenge they face as well. So I don't mean to put them out there to dry, because they're also susceptible to the same kinds of.
They're not the only ones.
Right,
Exactly.
exactly.
Bollywood,
Right.
yeah, every.
There are images we share in the board meetings that can reinforce bias. What do you imagine what I'm talking about? I think maybe even the equity committee might have mentioned this. When we show our data, our charts, if we don't problematize those data, we're just reinforcing. Yep. Yep, those kids coming from Chicago just don't have the educational experience. They can't learn. See, it's proven by our data. We have to be careful about how we're engaging with the images that we share.
I think when we did this exercise, in my head I just kept going, we could really just say Mark Twain Elementary, Wickham Elementary, and then do the same exact exercise. And like the things that maybe we came up with about Mark Twain, I guess, and I see it more in the community, fall to that's the school where black kids go. But then I just know from my experience, like my wife's classroom had like 20 kids in it last year, and like 2 kids were black. But the thought out there is that they were all black, and that they couldn't learn, and that they were the trouble and they were problems. So like I just keep thinking about that there, as opposed to like, and then what you're talking about, how we present our data, that's the same way. Like we've got this school with 78% free and reduced lunch, and then some of us that maybe why I go, man, the kids aren't like our kids, they look different, or they're a different background, and then really the majority of students there are actually if you separate out all the colors, then the majority of students at Mark Twain are minorities, but if you separate them out by class, the biggest group is white students.
And then I mentioned Charlie, and I believe you all know Charlie is on the equity committee, so that's why we should have probably done introductions earlier. We didn't even hand out the thing that introduced us.
They're so
Anyway, Charlie really forced me to have a shift over, because we were looking at the data and talking about when we looked at some of the data on FAST with the African American students that 50% are not proficient. We're not talking about the 50% who are. So the story we tell about kids isn't the 50% who are proficient, of black kids who are proficient. It's those 50% who aren't. And boy, that influences. And we have to keep thinking about those things. Yeah. All right, so these are some of the reflection questions we offered to teachers. How might implicit bias explain our disproportionality data? What if? We say you don't have to buy these ideas, but we'd like you to rent them for a while. Let's try them on for size. See if you can go there. See, what might it look like if these things play out for us?
When you guys do that part of it with the discipline, because a lot of what I hear when I talk with parents or teachers when we talk about that particular thing is that, well, if the kids are getting in trouble, they should be the one, they should get disciplined. Like sometimes maybe now trying to bring numbers down that don't discipline kids, does that make sense? But then they'll say like, but if the kids are doing something bad, they need to be disciplined. Now we're not doing it. So like, do you hear that when you're talking to teachers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real challenge for them, even as they're seeing some of these and engaging the idea that maybe I'm over-disciplining one group of kids and not another. I still have to discipline kids.
Right.
So there's some of those questions that are beyond our project. The Restorative Justice Project is why? What's the purpose of just like getting to those core ideas? If the purpose is it about exclusion and isolation, or is it about re-engagement? And, all of those kinds of questions are things that are tough, and you don't get many opportunities to talk about them in schools. It's why do we discipline, and then how, and those kinds of things. So those things are happening. They're kind of outside of what we're trying to get people to say is these things. Reflect, so we give them a reflection tool and say, okay, at the end of the day, right, we'll eventually get to where it becomes habit in the moment, but for now, at the end of the day, stop, think about an experience you had where a student of color was misbehaving and you gave a disciplinary response, and just ask yourself some questions like, could I have been watching students of color more than white students? Was I overestimating their maturity level? Those sorts of things that we know from research actually play out. The first thing we have them do is actually collect data. So we share this stuff, and then we say, all right, now go collect some data and come back and tell us. We pick 5 minutes in a school day in the same space for all the teachers to observe. So maybe 5 minutes in the hallway at passing period between third and fourth period. And then they do a series of these. And they have to mark what was the behavior and what was the race and gender of the child. And just doing that's hard. Like, they're not used to doing that, so that's tough. And then they would often come back and say, so I know, like I remember one teacher in particular said, so I was remembering the research, and so I was really paying attention to who I was watching, and so, like my black boys were kind of futzing around in the hallway doing this stuff, and then my white girls were doing this. And I never noticed that they were doing that before. I was paying attention over there, and so this is one of the strategies, is awareness. It's a huge strategy. Once you know about implicit bias, I didn't ask them to change their behavior. I didn't ask them to change how they looked, but they did start to change. And so we can kind of get to that, but some of that's really outside of where we can go in this project. Because they have to figure out, how do we set standards of behavior in our classroom? Another part of PBIS, the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports program, is starting to have more of this kind of cultural conversation and starting to recognize we have to have explicit conversations that don't have assumptions that we all have the same practices, that respect means the same at home and in the neighborhood as it does in the classroom, and that the way we interact and engage, we can't assume it's always the same. So we need to be explicit about that. So there are things that I think are happening and can happen more around that. All right, so again, some of the questions we asked them, we also really push them to say, how would you know? So you're reflecting, was I watching students of color more than others? Well, how would you know? So we're really trying to get them to not just say, well, no, I wasn't, but really say, how would you know? What are some tests you can do for yourself? How can you investigate that possibility more? And we get in then fill with some of those things like, well, in grading, maybe I could do some blind grading, or I could get someone else to come and look at my assessments and things like that. So these are the questions I wanted to leave for you to be thinking about. Because I really want it to be, I wanted both for you to understand what we're doing, but I also want you to engage in these reflections. So when you're looking at disciplinary data, I want you to think about how you're interacting with it. What are the questions you're the first to ask or not? What are the assumptions you might be bringing, and how might implicit bias impact your thinking? How might some of this stuff that we talked about influence the way you're thinking about a policy response to disciplinary disproportionality? And I don't need you to necessarily do that right this moment, but I want you to be thinking about that. I'm back together with you again in a couple of weeks. So this is sort of your homework, if you will. Do you have questions about these questions?
Can you email those to us?
I will.
Thank you. Oh, good.
And I actually have more questions for you even.
Policy one is really interesting to me. How does implicit bias find its way into policy? I mean, I'll be thinking about that one because policy is long-standing and going to have, both good and bad outcomes. Right? I mean, that's a big deal. I need to think about that.
We actually were also talking earlier about questions we could pose to you. And so another one I was thinking about after seeing the peer discussion with the Twain and Longfellow teachers, the principal at Twain offered a story Do you remember this, the story of, what if we have a black child who lives with their father in the basement with the father's girlfriend?
Yeah.
So there's a story that you were just told. And I want you to think about, how have you used that story since? How did that story impact you? What have you done with it? And what questions did you ask about that story? Because that story fit a stereotype, and it was a story that was probably based on evidence. I don't know that because I didn't get to ask him. Was this a kid you knew? Was the kid in Iowa City or Chicago? And I don't know that. And if I wasn't paying attention to that, I might be repeating that story.
Right.
So let me help you understand
Right.
Twain. There's all these kids that live in basements with their single dads and girlfriends. That's what happens to the stories we hear.
Yeah.
Now, you were there for the one, I apologize, I didn't remember your words. There was something said by one of the staff that really struck me. And I had a gut response I wanted to fire right back with. And I didn't, but I talked with the administrator the next day about it. And it was a staffer that said, well, if a teacher wants to transfer that doesn't want to teach those students, they should be allowed to. And in my gut, I felt, if you don't want to teach any kid that comes through the door, you should get the hell out of this district. I'm glad I didn't say that, but still, I have a problem where someone, if we allow that, aren't we admitting that, and that we have an instructor that isn't willing to teach everyone? And then on the other side of the argument is, well, if you keep that teacher there that you know doesn't want to teach those students, are you perpetuating a bad? So that I've been struggling with that one ever since that meeting. And I still, I know there's a contractual thing that we have, and if they want to transfer and those things. But boy, from a gut level, it sounded to me like this is exactly what we're fighting. And are those the troops you want to go into battle with?
So I would invite you to think about that as a question before we come together again. And I'll just toss out a couple of things, because I do remember that. And I remember my norm is assume positive intent. And so I need to come up with some interpretations, and then I need to come up with some alternate stories and again, these are sort of strategies, some different, what else might be happening with those teachers, what else might be happening, what else might be happening. And one thing I will share, part of what we skipped is we have a little what this project is and what it isn't. One of the things this isn't is a project designed to help teachers talk about race with kids. We don't have time to do that with them. They want to do it and know they need to. We don't train them to do that. And when they're not ready to do that, it can have some kind of bad consequences when they do. So it could be a teacher just being honest, like, I don't have this experience and I'm afraid I'm gonna hurt kids. So that's part of my assuming positive intent is it could not be, I'm not willing to do it because I'm racist. It could be, I don't think I'm any good at this. And I feel incompetent and scared, and I might hurt a child unintentionally. I need to be somewhere else. So not that it's okay, because the whole system, everyone needs to get okay with that. That's a professional development question. Because teachers aren't coming out of teacher prep programs ready to really fully engage with the diversity of kids that we have in our classrooms. So it's a great question to be thinking about. All right, expect and accept non-closure. We have, I'm sorry I forgot to hand these out. We've just got a quick little bio on me and Ellen as your coaches, and we have an exit ticket in the left side that I'd love for you to take a couple minutes to fill out right now. And I only have given you a couple minutes, so if you want to skip the key takeaways, the what was clear and key takeaways we find often have same answers, so you can skip one of those. thinking that I would shift from the implicit bias training to kind of exercising equity and leadership and what it looks like at the school board level. There's a whole section on an achievement in implicit bias we didn't get to today. So maybe we can talk about what balance, do we want to keep going with some of that and show the other? You can help me think about that.
Yeah.
Well, we're here to give you as much as we can, but yeah, that's Thank you for getting up here early Sunday afternoon.
Very good use of time.
Thank you.
Oh, we need to adjourn. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Oh, I moved to adjourn.
Second, all in favor? Aye.
Good point.
I mean, it's easy to forget that we are in a school board meeting. 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 We are in a school board meeting.